away, we are going to be talking about the Titans today. We've covered this in some instances in previous live streams, previous videos. But before I went right ahead and started creating content around Zeus and the Olympians, I did that one video about Hades, which was interesting, kind of laying the groundwork for what we'll be talking about as we continue through these Orphic rhapsodies. But what I found, and what I found to be most intriguing, was how little there was on all of the other Titans. You have quite a bit of material on Kronos. You have quite a bit of material on Rhea. You have quite a bit of material on some of the lower end orders, right? Like Helios and Selene, Hecate, for one. However, there is a dearth of other Titans who are rarely ever mentioned in any of the sources. What's up, Sage Rainbow Hall? Welcome aboard. And so what I decided to do, because of this lack of information, was dig in deep, find some textual sources, and start to take a look at what the Titans are presenting as. Now, this was a methodological approach that took quite a few strange, maybe unorthodox turns in order to uncover. But what we're looking at is essentially in the Titans, the mythology of the Titans that comes down to us from Hesiod, from Orpheus, the Orphic Rhapsodies, and then also in the fragments that we get from the Neoplatonists, is what I've found to be a really, really complex metaphysical framework. And what this live stream is going to be all about is an exploration of said framework. Now, this framework could probably be reshuffled several different ways. This is based on the textual sources that we have of the Titans, and it's based on what we know about how the late antique Greeks, or some of the Orphics even, would have seen the cosmos. And there's a great Hermetic axiom that's going to play into what we're talking about, as above and so below. What we're looking at isn't just how the cosmos was generated, but also, and this is probably the most intriguing for our exploration, how our own mind is constructed, or how the mind or the soul, both in some ways, are constructed through this cosmological generation. And so we've got a couple of people in here now. I think I've got 3, so I will get started. And we will just start rambling through this. There's a lot of slides to go through today. So let's begin with Hesiod and all of the extant sources that we have. I didn't put Homer in here, mainly because Homer doesn't say anything different than Hesiod. And so we're just going to start there. So Hesiod begins in Theogony, and he says that she, Gaia, lay with Ouranos, the sky, and bare deep swirling Oceanus, Coeus, Creus, Hyperion, Iapetus, Theia, Rhea, Themis, Mnemosyne, and gold-crowned Phoebe, and the lovely Tethys. So what we see here is classic Hesiodic generation of the Titans. And you can see that he says this in lines 132 to 134. But I found this other fragment from Alcman, and this is from about the 6th century BCE. And he says that the father Ouranos, the sky, was said already, is called Akmon, because heavenly motion is untiring, Akmatos. And the sons of Ouranos are Akmonadai. Okay, so the Titans. The ancients make these 2 points clear. Alkmon, they say, tells that heaven belongs to Akmon. Now, this is a really interesting word here that I came across really late in the research for this show. But this term of Akmon is actually the Greek word for anvil or a pestle. Now, which one is it? There's very different functions for an anvil and for a pestle. Now, a pestle, of course, meaning a mortar and pestle. We're smashing something, so there is a manufacturing element, as we would see with an anvil. An anvil is meant for pounding metal. and in the the smithing process, but it has its roots in a Proto-Indo-European with cognates in Sanskrit, Lithuanian, and potentially even in English as a hammer. Obviously, that's not from Hesiod's Theogony. I missed that there when I was going through these slides. But the term derives from that root, ak, which means sharp-pointed, which also gives rise to akmatos, untiring and inexhaustible. Now, this is a quality explicitly attributed to the celestial motion in the Alcman fragment. Now, this semantic field establishes Akmon not merely as a physical implement, but as a metaphysical principle, the inexhaustible generative power that precedes even Ouranos, the sky itself. So, in Hesiod, he talks of cosmic measurements, of the top-down, essential, how do you measure the cosmos itself? And he says if you took a bronze anvil and you dropped it, it would take falling 9 days and nights from heaven to land in the earth, and then an additional 9 more from the earth to Tartarus, suggesting that there is a mirrored cosmos happening here. Now, this vertical trajectory charts the emanative descent from celestial purity to terrestrial manifestation, and then even further now into the chthonic depths. So thus the anvil becomes a cosmographic instrument measuring the ontological distances between the domains of being. So this is really interesting that we have this term, akmon, because what we're looking at is essentially the dimensions and or the method in which these the Titans, essentially, I forget the term that he's using here, what the Titans are doing. Now, in our typical exploration of the Titans, when we're reading the mythology, we know of them as just being born from Ouranos and Gaia. Kronos rules for a little while. Hesiod talks about it as a golden age. Plato mirrors that as well. There's a golden age of man, but then, of course, comes Zeus, and then the Olympian reign. And so what happens after the Titanomachy, wherein Zeus and the Olympians overthrow Kronos and the Titans, they become relegated to somewhat of a footnote. There are some elements of the Titans that play out in the rest of the mythos, mainly from the Titanesses, from the females, and then the men basically are all cast into Tartarus at certain points and or released at certain points, depending upon the level of their sin against the cosmos, so to speak. And so what's really interesting here is although they come back in some later myths, the question is never really answered: what is the function of the Titans in the grand cosmological scheme? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, what I found interesting about this pestle metaphor was there is a great deal of this crater metaphor, or a mixing bowl that happens in later Platonic and Hermetic traditions. The demiurge is said to mix everything in this mixing bowl, and that is how the creation of the soul, the creation of other elements are made. So while Akmon represents the descending formative principle, this crater symbolism later embodies the receptive vessel in which the cosmic elements amalgamate or come together. So in Plato's Timaeus, the demiurge employs a crater to blend the soul substance of the cosmos. The Hermetic corpus in the Hermeticum further develops this symbolism, presenting the crater filled with the nous, or the divine intellect, into which human souls must immerse themselves for spiritual regeneration. Again, oh my god, I just left a bunch of these bibliographies just Hesiod here. I was in a rush to get this done, so forgive me. But let's continue on. So this concept of Akmon and the crater of the soul, we have this formative, like, pounding of material, right? So if we imagine the cosmos, there is just this undifferentiated set of materials, and eventually what has to happen is the intellect has to rearrange all of that into something that makes sense. So what we're seeing in this mythology isn't just the generation of beings, but the generation of cosmic principles, of the mind of God, of the mind of the gods, or Zeus in this case. So what we see is we have three levels here that are going to come into greater focus as we go through the rest of these slides. But in this formative element, Akmon is a shaping principle. He's the anvil on which basically the cosmos is hammered out. He finds its natural complement in the crater as the containing principle. So first we have to hammer out what this is, and then there has to be a reception of what that intellect is. There's also a vertical and horizontal integration, where Akmon emphasizes a vertical transmission through these cosmic domains, example, the falling anvil that Hesiod talks about, while the crater emphasizes a horizontal integration, or a bowl, in which the blending of these elements as they fall form together to complete a cross-section of this metaphysical reality. And we're going to see this mapped out here shortly. But this also has an initiatory significance. So the Akmonadai represent the primordial powers requiring integration. So the crater represents the transformative vessel for spiritual regeneration. Now, Alkmund's attribution of heaven to Akmon thus reveals a profound insight. The celestial domain emerges not ex nihilo, but through the untiring action of prior generative principles. So that's a lot of heavy, heady shit, and a lot of that is going to be what we have today, unfortunately. So if that's not your bag, I don't blame you. But I want to take a step over to how Orpheus brings this together in the Orphic Rhapsodies. What's most intriguing is he begins with the Titanic daughters first. So the firstborn is Themis, and then gentle Tethys, and then the mother, Kypris, then Mnemosyne, and then the Musai, Theia, the mother of light, and Gaia, and Dione, the mother of creation, the radiant Phoebe, and who held seat at Delphi, and the glorious Rhea, the mother of the aegis-bearing Olympian king of all. Then he says that the 7 Titanic sons are born. Now, Hesiod has 6, Orpheus has 7, so this is intriguing. Why is there a difference between 6 and 7? The 7 Titanic sons are querying Koios, the father of Leto and Asteria. There's Creus, the lord of the vast constellations. Mighty Phorcys, who we don't see in Hesiod, who rules the great depths of the sea. Okay, so we've got Phorcys and we've got Oceanus in here. Then we have light-giving Hyperion, the father of the sun and the moon. The genial Iapetus, the father of the race of men. Oceanus, who encircles and envelops the earth with his many streams, and the greatest king of all, the kingly Kronos. Now, there is a birth order present here, and there is a birth order present within Hesiod. And if you read these very closely, you start to see that there is a generative hierarchy, and it's not just that they are haphazardly placed in order here. There's a very specific order. Kronos being the last means he is the final piece of this layer of reality in order for the next level of generative nature to come about. And we'll see that as we look at these maps that I've produced. Of these mighty sons and daughters of the earth, it was Kronos who Nyx cherished and cultivated most of all. So we see a female element born first, and then the male element born second, that is, of the Titans. Now, if we remember back to some of our Orphic rhapsodic expeditions previously, the first sons of Ouranos and Gaia were the Cyclopes and the Hecatonchires, and those, they don't necessarily factor in here, but we will touch on them as we continue. Oh, thanks, Vesper. I'm glad that you're enjoying. Yeah, if you have any questions while I'm riffing, just let me know. Just let me know. We're going to keep moving, though. So I wanted to take a look at how Orpheus also depicts the Titans within the Orphic hymns. He says, O mighty Titans, who from heaven, or Ouranos, and earth, Gaia, derive your noble illustrious birth, our fathers' fires in Tartarus profound who dwell, deep merged beneath the solid ground. Fountains and principles, from whom begin the afflicted and miserable race of man, who not alone in earth's retreats abide, but in the ocean and the air reside, since every species from your nature flows, which all prolific nothing barren knows. Avert your rage, if from the infernal seats one of your tribes should visit our retreats. So there's a lot within the poem. Fountains and principles, I really like that they touch on that within the hymn, because we see them as caricatures, we see them as participants in story, but more so what we are looking at when we look at the Titans is cosmic principles. So if Uranus is the sky and Gaia is the earth, that's like one of the first polarities that we're going to see. But beyond that, what we start to see is this explosion from unity into multiplicity, and what that requires are specific principles in order for any kind of relationship between multiplicity to exist. What must be first built in order for unity to understand itself as multiplicity is an intellect. And that is what we are seeing being born in this generative capacity. Okay, so this is a typical map that we would see presented of the Titans. You have Uranus and Gaia, then you have the boys up top, and then the girls down below, and then you see is a basic family tree. Now, this isn't necessarily incorrect. It's what I would like to call incomplete. It's not showing us the full picture, right? And the reason for this is the Greeks didn't need this information the way that we do. They knew it. It was a part of their worldview. It was how they understood the world. These principles were guiding them in everyday life. It wasn't some high level, as Vesper says in the chat, depth mythology, right? For them, these were the guiding principles of life. This was how they saw the world and how they understood the principles that guided generative nature. So these are the things that they just kind of knew. And of course, there's going to be varying degrees. Certain people within certain parts of antique society are going to have the time, the availability, the resources to dive into some of this deeper. But this is what we typically see when we're talking about modern study of mythology, especially when it comes to the Titans. Okay, sky and earth birthed all these guys, and then they rebelled against their father. We know that myth. We've talked about it here on the channel. And then they rule for a time, and then, of course, Zeus overtakes them. Well, there's a lot more to it. So, today we're going to be talking about the Titans as metaphysical principles. Now, I've got a piece here, and this is from Hesiod. And Uranus the sky came bringing on night and longing for love, and he lay about Gaia the earth, spreading himself full upon her. Then the sun from his ambush stretched forth his left hand, and in his right hand the great long sickle with jagged teeth, and swiftly lopped off his own father's members and cast them away to fall behind him. These sons whom he begot himself, great Uranus, used to call Titans, or the strainers, in reproach. For he said that they strained and did presumptuously a fearful deed, and that vengeance for it would come afterwards. In the last few lines, Hesiod says that all 6 brothers are involved. 6 brothers, right? Versus the 7 that we see in Orpheus. Were involved in the ambush and the castration of Uranus. We had 5 holding him down, while the 6th cuts off his genitals, or his generative faculty. So it's not just his cutting off of the phallus, it's the cutting off of the principle of generation. Now, this is really interesting because Kronos being the youngest and the last point of the Titanic world before the Olympian order, which will basically be the generation of the next layer of reality, or the next level of condensed reality, is the one who basically contains that phallative generative power that is taken off of Uranus. So what we're looking at here is the Titans representing a sophisticated metaphysical system that structured the ancient understanding of reality, and we do see this mirrored in some other cosmological models as well. Perhaps not in the same depth because we don't have the same documentation as we do with the Greeks, but I do plan on touching on that on my Substack as well. There's quite a bit that I uncovered here, and I'll be releasing it all on Substack, so if you haven't checked me out over there, please do. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be moving beyond the narrative readings, beyond this functional cosmological interpretation, this generation that Hesiod has, and looking at them as personifications of cosmic principles that order reality through their complementary operations. But for us to do that, we have to basically recontextualize, re-architect what is being said within these stories. So Iamblichus says in his De Mysteries, is not every sacred ritual legislated intellectually from first principles according to the laws of the gods? For each rite imitates the order of the gods, both the intelligible and the celestial, and each possesses the eternal measures of beings and the wondrous symbols which have been sent here by the Demiurge, the father of all things. Now, why do I have this here? Why am I talking about Theurgy, the Demiurge? It's because these principles that all the theurgists in Iamblichus's day understood, or would have understood, are essentially the principles within the mind of the demiurge themselves. All theurgical acts, all ritual acts that we have from late antique, from the antique world, are demiurgic mimics. What I mean by that is each of these rituals is meant to reenact or replay or mimic in some way a celestial or cosmological event. The rites that we perform, the rites that they performed, were us essentially imitating, kind of like toddlers do to us as adults. And so what we are looking at is when we are doing a ritual, it's essentially the same thing that happened cosmologically with the gods. So this Titanic genealogy, this mythology, these rites associated with, reveal the metaphysical architecture of the cosmos. Now, this is based, what we're going to uncover here is based on Hesiod and not the Orphic, because that seventh element within the Orphic is different, and I didn't have time to see how that flexed into it, and maybe I'll do a secondary part to this live stream in the future. But we have 6 masculine, feminine Titanic pairs, which create complementary cosmic functions, and each of their offsprings represent increasingly specified operations. So we have a first order, a secondary order, and in some cases we're going to look into tertiary orders. And I might even do live streams on each of the secondary orders because they're extremely complex. An organized progression from these universal principles into particular manifestation. And that is what we're going to get into. So we got Vesper says, what I mean is the deeper meaning to mythology, like the guiding principles you referred to. Yes. I mean, yeah, that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing. We're going to be digging in deep. So what did I do when I approached this? We're reading beyond the literal genealogy to functional metaphysics. We're using Neoplatonic principles of emanation to interpret this generational progression. And we're using the etymological evidence for these metaphysical functions. So it's within the names. Everything is contained within the names. At its essence, this cosmography reveals how primordial unity undergoes necessary differentiation to establish intelligible parameters through which ordered existence becomes possible. What does that mean? It's the structure of how this whole thing unfolds. It is how unity becomes multiplicity and begins to relate to itself. It's how the mind works. It's how consciousness works. Okay? So there's 2 major things we have to look at as we look into this. There's a vertical emanation, and then there is a hexagrammatic manifestation matrix in which this vertical emanation kind of embeds itself, and then through that matrix we get almost like this crater, right? So we're going back to this image of the anvil falling into reality, but it's being received by a bowl. It's being received by this hexagrammatic bowl. So, Chanel Warhorse says the Stel 777. Yeah, I this has got to be in everything, because these are so like each of the cultures in antiquity, they have their own particular spin on things. However, none of them are so different from the other that they were incapable of coming to terms with each other. In fact, the primary mode of thinking within the antiquated world was that they saw each other's gods as the same, just slightly different representations or cultural adornments, different cultural garments, but the same principles exist. It's not like the Greeks made this up overnight. There was so much melting pot of ideas in that time between Egypt, Phoenicia, from Mesopotamia and Babylon up into Samothrace in Anatolia. All of these places were trading ideas, and what we see across cultures is the same thing. So in this image, this is a I don't know how well you can see it. The screenshot that I got of this is not super clear, but I do have a link that I'm going to present in the description, and I'll post it here as well. The vertical emanation starts here with Phanes, or Phanes. Okay, now in the Orphic cosmology, he is the first point. The cracking open of the silver egg is the first differentiation from essentially unaltered, undifferentiated matter. Now, as you can see, there are 4 rays of light that signify his fourfold being. Often everything about him is 4, so there's almost a directional component from this point. It can go anywhere, but it chooses instead to go down, right? And in this, we have also some geometrical stuff occurring. It's a geometrical explosion, if you will, for lack of a better term, or progression would be another term. So from that point, we create a line. And from that line of Phanes to Nyx, we have our first differentiation from Phanes to Nyx. She receives his primordial light. It's a light that can't be seen by anything else in the cosmos but Nyx. And from that line, so we have 2 points. Now we're going to need 3 points if there's a geometrical progression happening here. And we can see it happening in the triangle that happens below. Nyx, Uranus, and Gaia create the first stable structure within the cosmic mind, the triangle, probably the most stable of all things. But there's also a primal polarity happening between Uranus and Gaia. This triangle then will balloon out into a square, which we'll go over later with the birth of the first children of Uranus and Gaia, the Cyclopes and the Hecatomchires. That provides the space for the 5th element, or the pentagram, to come into view with the birth of the Titans, which then generates the 6th, which is the hexagram, which is with that final piece with Cronus and delimiting basically time. Now, I'm going to go into each one of these in detail, but what you can see here is each of the Titanic pairs. This one is incomplete slightly. For some reason, Theia site is hiding behind Hyperion, but we have an illuminative axis, which we'll go into. We have a liminal axis down at the bottom with Iapetus and Clymene. We have a celestial axis with Crius and Eurybia. We have an intelligible axis with Coeus and Phoebe, and we have circumscribing with Oceanus and Tethys, and then finally a temporal axis with Cronus and Rhea. So each one of these are demarking very specific modes of the cosmos and or consciousness. But dead center within all of it is Themis, the first daughter, as we saw within Orphic, the Orphic Rhapsodies. Divine order is the principle in which all of these things converge. We also have 2 kind of weird outliers here. Dione, who's essentially, in some cases, a female version of Zeus, almost like a pre-Zeus, if you will, or a cousin of, who comes from this, I think we'll get into it. She comes from one of the lineages, but she represents oracular wisdom, and she's kind of separate from the secondary orders that we'll go into. And then we have Mnemosyne, who is the cosmic memory over here on the right. Now, this, I can appreciate, is an incredibly complex cosmic map, and it only gets more complex. But this is the general image of what we are looking at when we're talking about the Titanic cosmos. And I will have these posted on my website after the live. So let's first talk about this vertical emanation. So we have Phanes, the firstborn, who emerges as the proto-intelligible light, meaning that it's not quite graspable. It can only be seen by Nyx, okay? This primordial manifestation that precedes all differentiation. It says in the Derveni Papyrus, when the currently existing came to be, Phanes then was named. This radiant principle contains within itself the generative potentiality of all subsequent cosmic articulation. So inside of Phanes is the all, is everything. Now, Nyx functions secondarily as the primary receptive, right? So it's the upper order mimic of this anvil falling into the mixing bowl. Her starry aspect reveals that she is this receiver of the light. Her role is a necessary darkness through which light becomes intelligible. So it's through Nyx that we can begin to understand the light of Phanes. It's this first differentiation, this vertical axis that we're talking about, and that is going to intersect with Gaia and Uranus. And again, we see a proto-formation of four directions, just like we see in Phanes, and it just keeps kind of coming down as we drop further down the emanations. So Gaia and Uranus constitute the first fully developed polarity. This primordial differentiation between the receptive Earth and the expansive or penetrative sky that establishes a dimensional template for all the subsequent cosmic architecture. It's this dual principle that creates the fundamental tension between containment and expansion that's necessary for manifestation. Are you guys still with me? Are you still with me? I know this is a lot, and I'm jamming it all down your throat as fast as possible. But this next piece it's going to start to make more sense. Oh yes, the method of poles by the square law. Yeah, take a look at what Chanel's talking about in the chat. I'm going to keep riffing. So what we have, develop out of that polarity between Gaia and Uranus is a hexagrammatic manifestation matrix. There are 6 primordial axes that intersect with each other and also have interplay within each other. So we have first the illuminative axis, which has Hyperion and Theia, which establishes the metaphysical conditions for consciousness itself. It's this primordial distinction between perceiver and perceived, between light and its reception. And right below that, in the diagram, you can see this liminal axis between Iapetus and Clymene, which mediates the ontological domains, creating the possibility of transmission between realms. So through establishing the thresholds rather than just impermeable barriers. So some of these other axes produce very rigid barriers. Iapetus and Clymene are different. They're essentially permeable barriers meant to be crossed through. We then have a celestial axis with Crius and Eurybia, which institutes cosmic regulation and establishes the hierarchical order and expansive power through which cosmic harmony sustains itself. And we're going to go into each one of these in detail. Then we have the circumscribing axis with Oceanus and Tethys, which delineates cosmic boundaries and the encircling of essentially almost everything, which just... like it says here, simultaneously defines and transcends the manifest cosmos. Then we have the intelligible axis, which is Coeus and Phoebe, which articulates the structures of divine knowledge. This is kind of an interrogative function that differentiates between the intuitive illumination, and then they synthesize parts of the intellect. And then finally, this temporal axis with Kronos and Rhea. This is the metaphysics of becoming, the limiting function of temporal existence, what we reside under. And they basically will birth what is known as the governance aspect within the Olympians. But at the center of all of it is Themis. At the center of all of it is Themis, the divine order, or what I like to call the nomothetic center, or the scientific governance. It's where all of these axes come together. It's kind of like the core part of consciousness. Everything has to run through divine order, and that's what Themis essentially is. So at the heart of this structure stands Themis, who is divine order, functioning not as one among many titanic powers, but as the principle through which the entire cosmic framework achieves structured coherence. If we look at her etymology, which means to set in place, it reveals her essential function, the establishment of fundamental ordering principles, without which differentiated existence would immediately collapse into chaotic indeterminacy. So it's without Themis, we've got nothing, essentially. This central positioning reveals insight into cosmic order not merely being derived from undifferentiated unity, but constitutes a specific determination of unity, one governed by law rather than just arbitrary generation of gods and beings. Now, the first prophet was Nyx, who then passes that to Gaia, and then after Gaia passes it to her daughter Themis, who then passes it on again and again, and we see that kind of come down. Now this comes from Aeschylus in his Eumenides. He says that it was from Nyx to Gaia to Themis that essentially is this oracular law. So there is an underpinning cosmic law that governs all of these powers and principles. Now, in the Basilides, he says, it is open to all men to reach unswerving Dike, justice, the attendant of holy Eunomia, good order, and wise Themis, divine law. Blessed are they whose sons choose to share their home. So you can see in here the Greeks, their penchant for putting divine order and cosmic order and law at the center of everything, without which nothing else works. And this is, it's the pillar of civilization. With whether you're in Egypt or Greece, divine order, whether it's Ma'at in Egypt or Themis in Greece, this is the center of the consciousness of the antique world. Now, what about the other outliers? Before we get to the axes, we got to talk about them. So there's Mnemosyne, who is essentially temporal preservation. So if Themis establishes cosmic law across these spatial domains, Mnemosyne institutes continuity across the temporal dimensions. Her function extends beyond just memory in the psychological sense, but encompasses what might be termed ontological persistence, this metaphysical principle through which identity maintains itself across transformational sequences. So it doesn't matter where you go in time and space, memory is essentially tracking and preserving that element of order or identity as we move through these orders of existence. So this model positions Mnemosyne within the lower right quadrant, which I referenced in the other one, which establishes primary connections to both the intelligible axis of Coeus and Phoebe and the circumscribing axis of Oceanus and Tethys, the liminal axis of Iapetus and Clymene, and the temporal axis of Kronos and Rhea. So she's going to float, right? This positioning reflects her particular association with the domains of knowledge, boundaries, mediation, and temporality, the four dimensions through which persistence achieves intelligible structure. We're talking about the construction of consciousness. Her offspring, the nine muses, represent the differentiation of this preservative function into specific modalities of transmission. Hesiod notes, Mnemosyne in the hills of Eleuthère, joined in love with the son of Kronos, Zeus, bear the Musai who dwell in banquets and pleasures of songs. This transmission function reveals a crucial insight, where Mnemosyne's preservative operation enables not merely static maintenance, but dynamic cultural evolution through which meaning perpetuates itself across generational boundaries. So up here is one element of this unity coming into multiplicity. And then from out of Mnemosyne, you see it exploding into all of these memory devices or mnemonic functions that we have in the arts, whether that's music, which carries some sort of memory, or hymns or epics. All of the different things that the muses inspire are attached to this temporal preservation of identity, or of the specific identity within this matrix. But on the other side, from Mnemosyne, we have Dione, right? The feminine version of Dio or Zeus, which is the oracular matrix, or the disclosure of these of the celestial matter, if you will. We'll get into it. There's a lot to it. Dione introduces a third transversal principle, which is mantic revelation. Her positioning within the upper left quadrant with Phoebe and Themis reveals her function within what might be termed an oracular triad, the threefold matrix through which divine disclosure manifests within the cosmos. We're talking about the disclosure of divine law through all orders of reality, whether that's disclosure to the gods or to mortal men. It's on this oracular center to do. So memory doesn't necessarily provide oracular revelation. It just transmits story or function or memory function through those elements. Oracular intuition is somewhat different. Her etymology as the feminine force of form of Zeus suggests her status as a receptive principle through which the celestial revelation, which, if I remember correctly, she's right underneath the celestial axis. And so dictating by the stars themselves, right? All of this oracular stuff is based on some sort of astrology or what the stars are telling us. And remember, the stars in the night sky are Night, Nyx herself, who was the first oracle, the first prophet. So Dione looks back towards Nyx, looks back towards that oracular function, and then disseminates that oracular function through the rest of lower reality. Her association with the oracle at Dodona, historically the oldest of the Greek oracular sites, further confirms that her primordial status within the economy of divine disclosure. So in certain traditions, she's identified as the mother of Aphrodite. That's after Zeus recreates the world, by the way, not the original formation of Aphrodite, which is when Uranus's genitalia are lopped off by Kronos and it falls into the sea. This suggests a profound connection between oracular revelation and also the generative principle of cosmic eros. So there's a distinct tie to that generative and the oracular revelation. Divine disclosure is not merely an intellectual comprehension, but a transformative attraction towards the beautiful. So what does that mean? When we receive an oracle, it's not just something that we receive within our mind. It is also a direction towards moving back towards unity or moving deeper into the generative mode. So it's not just something that we get like a tarot card reading and we go, oh, I get it. It is a directive to move deeper into the experience. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I just wanted to touch on that briefly. Okay, so we're back to this here. We can see where we've kind of just talked about Mnemosyne over on the right, in between the intelligible and the circumscribing. Dione in between the celestial and the temporal. So again, the stars are that oracular funnel in which the oracles, which are kind of spread out, right? You've got them kind of all over the place, but there's intuition within Phoebe, who is also an oracle at Delphi, but then you have Dione, who is more of just kind of a slightly different oracle. And I think what I'll do is I'll probably just dive into those deeper in another live stream rather than derail us. But I do think it's interesting that we see these three kind of like non-married titans, Mnemosyne, Themis, and Dione, who kind of just like are there in the Titanic world before Zeus and not paired up. Because as I looked at these pairs, I'm like, well, there's all these other titans that are not part of it, and I was like, how do they function? And voila, here they are. So let's look at some of the axes. Thanks, Chanel. Or is it Channel Warhorse? So this illuminative axis, this is the top one, and I'll go back to kind of look at it here. From that vertical emanation, it kind of feels like the first thing that we need is this illumination. So we're talking about the metaphysics of divine light, which begins with Hyperion, or he who goes above. He embodies the active principle of illumination, the penetrative, radiant force of light as metaphysical principle. So this is pre-celestial light, right? This is before the sun itself. So Phanes is the idea of light. Hyperion is another more condensed order, or unseen light, which is then later projected from his son Helios. Now, conversely, in this axis is Theia on the other side, which translates to divine, but is also the embodied receptive principle of vision. So she has the capacity to perceive the illumination and transform it into conscious awareness. So she's sight, right? And so we see another mirror here happening. If Phanes, his light can only be seen by his daughter and consort Nyx, it's the same being mirrored here with the lower order in Hyperion. Hyperion, his light is received by Theia. Now, in Theogony, Hesiod's Theogony, he says, Theia was subject in love to Hyperion and bare great Helios, clear Selene, and Eos, the dawn. So Pindar talks about it here. He says, Theia is the mother of Helios, Theia of many names. For your sake men honor gold as more powerful than anything else, and through the value you bestow on them, O queen. Ships contending on the sea and yoked teams of horses in swift whirling contests become marvels. Gotta love you some Pindar. Diodorus Siculus, in his Library of History, says, of Hyperion we are told that he was the first to understand, by diligent attention and observation, the movement of both the sun and the moon and the other stars, and the seasons as well, in that they are caused by these bodies to make these facts known to others. What does it mean when Hyperion understands and observes the movement of the sun, the moon, and the stars? He's the first to grasp that. What does that mean? Obviously, people can see the sun. What we're talking about here is an allusion to a cognitive or conscious function, wherein the perception of these things only happens through the metaphysics of divine light. Hyperion is the first to reveal these things through the emanation of his divine light. And on the other side of the polarity, Theia is that receptive element. So it is essentially what we're looking at here is this is how our consciousness perceives light. So from this, light is essentially portrayed as the medium of intelligibility. Without light, we can't understand any of these differentiations. None of it happens, essentially. That's why this is the first one, and it's so important to have at the top of that hexagram. So this differentiated function of what I call the Hyperionides establish light as not merely a revelatory agent, but as the medium through which intelligibility itself emerges. Without light, we can't figure any of this out. So Hyperion is the active principle of illumination, and Theia is the receptive principle of vision. They embody that polarity. And from them, existing, of course, within the bounds of time, Hyperion and Theia don't. They exist above that order, above the order of Kronos. Even though he's kind of like the king of everything, time exists underneath Kronos, if that makes sense. Like if you're stacking these orders from Nyx and Phanes to Gaia and Uranus to the Titans and then to the Olympian order below, time exists down here with the Olympians, under the guise of Kronos, who is like the top of that. Now they're also eternal and they kind of exist out of time, but I think that's just because they're further condensed versions, if you will. It's very, very kind of muddy, and it depends on who you're talking to, whether it's Damascus or any of the other Neoplatonists, or if you're looking at it from an Orphic perspective. I'm trying to bring them together, in a sense, to show us. But Helios, Selene, and Eos, the dawn, these are physical celestial manifestations, whereas these Hyperion and Theia are light, but they are unseen. We cannot see them with our physical eyes. We can only perceive them with the intellect, with the mind. But the celestial bodies that we see later, the sun and the moon, are varied in their disclosure of things. So Eos is a proleptic temporality, which is like the anticipated but not yet present light. Helios is the present temporality, the fully disclosed light. And the moon is almost like, and this is why it's probably associated with oracles, is there's a reflective element. It's not a full revelation, there's some concealment involved. Eos is a liminal disclosure of light. Helios is an intensive disclosure, and Selene is an extensive disclosure. What does that mean? Selene is the dispersed reflective revelation of this mediative presence of light, and Helios is the full revelation. So this is why we see in so many of the solar cults, Helios, the Sol Invictus cult, Jesus even, all of this is solar related because it's a full revelation, whereas the oracles, dependent on the moon, they kind of keep some stuff concealed. It's not a full revelation. And Eos is somewhere in between that polarity. It's like not quite dark, not quite light. Another beautiful map. As we can see here in the secondary order, if we are looking at that axis underneath that hexagrammatic matrix is this explosion outward of more concrete versions of what Hyperion and Theia are. Okay? You see Hyperion, the primordial light, the reception of that light, and then the generation of new variations of that light, whether that's the moon, which is known as full shining, all-seeing for Helios, and rosy-fingered for Eos. So we see also in this a herald, the herald of the dawn, the disclosure of imminent revelation, the sun is coming up. And then the revealer, the disclosure of objective reality, the sun reveals all to us. As we see during the day, we can see everything because of the sun. But in the night, we have the mediator, the disclosure of the reflective mystery. So in the day, we have the full mystery. In the night, we have something concealed. It's really beautiful, though, if you think about it poetically. I love this. So if you don't have any questions, I'll just keep plugging through. The next axis we're going to talk about is right across from it, down at the bottom, the liminal axis, which is the metaphysics of permeable boundaries. So we have Iapetus, the piercer, who embodies the active principle of limitation, the force that establishes boundaries between cosmic realms and ontological categories. He's also the limit of mortality. So he is the reason that we are mortal. Within the boundaries of time, there has to be a limit of transition between forms. Now, he doesn't pair up with another Titaness who is born. He pairs up with one of the Oceanids, one of the daughters of Oceanus. Clymene, who is basically translated to famous or renowned, and she embodies the receptive principle of that transition, of moving between forms. There's a fluidity between forms. She's the medium through which beings move between different ontological states, alive, dead, those sorts of things. It's funny, too, because your fame and your renown, they're known in your life, but for a lot of people, it was what happens in death. That's where your fame and your renown is. Now, their offspring represent really interesting. So in the Hyperionides, we saw that triangle of three new beings. We're going to see four here with the... so you see 3 and then 4. It's like they're stacked on each other. There's a geometric progression happening. The offspring of Iapetus and Clymene are fairly well known, right? We've got Atlas, the guy who holds the cosmos on his back. He's the cosmic support. Prometheus is anticipatory mediation between things. So he's a thinker. He's insightful. Epimetheus is kind of like after that. It's like consequential. What happens? Whatever happens, we have to deal with now. And Menoetius is excess, is moving way beyond that. Now these boys, these Iapetian boys, I forget what I put them in there as, but they signify boundaries as well. Between Olympian and Titanic, between mortal and divine, between chthonic and terrestrial boundaries. Now Hesiod relates, he says, now Iapetus took his wife the neat-ankled. Imagine that compliment. The neat-ankled. The neat-ankled maid Clymene, daughter of Oceanus, and went up with her into one bed. And she bare him stout-hearted son, Atlas. Also she bare very glorious Menoetius, and clever Prometheus, full of various wiles, and then, of course, the scatterbrained Epimetheus. Now Homer says, the undermost limits of the earth and sea, where Iapetus and Kronos seated, have no shining of the sun-god Hyperion to delight them, nor winds delight, but Tartarus stands deeply about them. This suggests that at one point, the idea was that Iapetus was in Tartarus. He was one of the titans that Zeus cast into Tartarus. Later on, Zeus kind of sees, let's let him out, but we'll get there. So what are we looking at here with these boys? Iapetus is the principle of limitation. Clymene is the receptive principle of that transition. Atlas, the first son, is necessary separation or cosmic support. He represents the function that maintains the separation between ontological realms, so he's the pillar, if you will, that serves as the support that upholds those divisions within the universe. He is the experience of burden and necessary limitation. Whereas Prometheus, He represents the function that perceives potentiality and facilitates its actualization. Now remember the classics with Prometheus. He's the firebringer. He's the one who anticipates. He's a thinker. He helps teach humanity, much to Zeus's chagrin. But he is the experience of transformative insight. Now his brother Epimetheus is the function that incorporates the actualized results. So Prometheus is anticipating a result. Epimetheus is how you deal, or how we deal with results. When something comes up with a consequence, what do we do? Ensuring the integration of new developments into your existing framework. You're starting to see here what I'm kind of getting at. These are cognitive functions. It's like, okay, so there's separation with Atlas. I keep different things apart. Well, with the Promethean part of my brain, I am thinking about what is potentially going to happen. Epimetheus is how do I deal with the consequences that just happened? And then you have Menoetius, who is excessive or is kind of marked by transgression. And he represents the function that demonstrates the necessary boundaries of cosmic order when they are violated. When something is violated, essentially going back to Themis. What happens when things have violated divine order in the cosmos? This experience of transgression and, again, consequence. So as we go through it, you kind of see there's a natural progression happening here. And I'll stop just for a second, check the chat. Hey, what's up? Healing with Diamonds. Good to see you. Thank you. I'm glad you got that piece and you enjoyed it. So let's look at the picture here of what this Iapetonides look like. So remember in the Hyperionides we had a triangle. Well, here we have a diamond, or potentially a square, where there's an Olympian Titanic boundary that Atlas upholds. Now below that, again, there's a mortal divine boundary that is held by Prometheus and Epimetheus. That's kind of the nature of Iapetus as well. He is mortality. So these two boys hold that. So we have forethought and afterthought. And then below the pillar of heaven, we have a celestial or a chthonic terrestrial boundary. So in death, your transgressions are tracked. You start to see this otherworldly judgment occurring with Menoetius. There will be a judgment of the cosmic order in death. So there's a vertical demarcation and a horizontal mediation between these boys. And there's a boundary validation that happens with Menoetius. It's really fascinating how you see these geometrically start to come into being. But also, the Clymene, transitional beauty, right? So even though there's a transition, there's a loss of form in death, there's a beauty to it. And that was something that was well known to them. So let's move on. We've got more axes to discover. The intelligible axis. This is divine intelligence. This begins with Coeus, otherwise known as the questioning one, the querying one. He embodies the active principle of intelligence itself. It's a penetrative, analytical capacity that dissects, reduces, interrogates, and comprehends cosmic order. It's interrogative intelligence. Whereas Phoebe, the bright one, embodies the receptive principle of prophetic wisdom, the intuitive capacity to perceive connections across temporal bounds. She is radiant intuition. Their progeny, Leto and Asteria, represent containers of concealed wisdom that will later generate such tertiary orders as Apollo, Artemis, and Hecate. Now, Aeschylus talks about this in the Eumenides. He says, "First, in this prayer of mine, I give the place of highest honor among the gods, to the first prophet Gaia, and after her to Themis, for she was the second to take this oracular seat of her mother, as legend tells. And in the third allotment, with Themis' consent and not by force, another Titaness, child of Chthon, Phoebe, took her seat here, and she gave it as a birthday gift to Phobos, Phoebus, or Apollo." Now, Valerius Flaccus in the Argonautica says, Coeus, in the lowest pit of Tartarus, burst the adamantine bonds, and trailing Jove's fettering chains invokes Saturnus and Tityus, and in his madness conceives a hope of scaling heaven. Yet though he repass the rivers in the gloom, the hound Cerberus of the Furies, the Erinyes, and the sprawling Hydra's crest repel him. Now, of course, we can go back to the idea of these titans being thrown into Tartarus. But what does that mean? They're being thrown into some sort of darkness, right? But there's a balance that has to be maintained, or there's some sort of moral violation, again, of the thematic order, this nomothematic order. What I think they're kind of getting at here, what Valerius Flaccus is saying, is unchecked interrogative intelligence is dangerous. And it is because of this imbalance within Coeus, without having the radiant intuition of Phoebe, that we see we need to have some sort of balance between our penetrative intelligence and our receptive and intuitive intelligence. There's a moral to almost all of these. And it's not that Coeus is evil or bad, it's just that without that balanced counterpoint, you start to get into very dangerous territory. You get the madness conceives a hope of scaling heaven, right? That's to me, that's what we try to do with science. Think of the Tower of Babel myth. It's we're going to climb all the way to heaven because we were too oronic. We don't have enough of that guy in reception. And so that's what we're talking about with this intelligible axis. We have the divine light first, then we have that fact that that divine light is going to have to pass through permeable barriers, and then this next order is this divine intelligence axis. So what about the secondary order that we see here? We get Leto, who is concealment, or wisdom as gestational potential, awaiting the appropriate moment for disclosure. Leto embodies wisdom as a concealed potential, this pregnant possibility that waits for manifestation in her children Apollo and Artemis. Now for Asteria, that's revelation, wisdom as distributed through illumination, providing orientation through partial disclosure, through the stars. Embodied wisdom as distributed manifestation, the dispersed illumination that guides through partial revelation. Okay, that was a bit repetitive. I probably could have cut that out. But the stars, there's concealed elements of wisdom within Leto, but there's partial revelation in Asteria. And then we see further distinction of how revelation comes about through Apollo and Artemis. There's a dual mode of articulated clarity through the sun and solar power of Apollo, and then there's an intuitive or natural discernment through Artemis. And then, as a center point between the two of them is Hecate, who has that kind of threshold, liminal space, moving between the two, and always kind of holding that space that the two poles can't have. Altogether, these coonatides manifest the containers or principles of intelligence. It's like the vessel of the mind, the various vessels through which divine knowledge can be received, right? These sister goddesses also establish complementary modalities of knowing, one that conceals in order to gestate, and one that reveals in order to guide in Asteria. Is this making sense to everybody? Because when I was reading it, my mind was just swirling as I was going through all this research. But here we see them pictured. Coeus and Phoebe, there's that divine potential, but then it branches off. We have Leto and concealed potential, who becomes pregnant with the divine will of Zeus, and from that union comes Apollo and Artemis in a tertiary level. That's concealment. But in revelation, what do we have? Who are the great revealers? Asteria, the starry one, distributes manifestation through two primary modes. Through essentially who is also the father of Hecate here, Perses, who isn't necessarily one of the coonatides, but is related to another branch as well. He kind of floats. But Perses is that destroyer of things that are no longer viable. So we see containment or concealment and revelation. Wisdom that illuminates through dispersion and guidance. Wisdom that gestates through darkness and before disclosure. It's really, really fascinating, neat stuff. Next axis. We're almost through them, guys. I swear. This is cosmic pattern. Think about the stars. Think about astrology. Think about the force that is employed by the stars. Now, in almost every single one of the esoteric traditions, the stars are in control of destiny. There's a fate that is decreed by the stars. Well, who's in charge of that? The Lord, the Ram himself, Creus, embodies the active principle of celestial order. So he is essentially the embodiment of that Themis order that we have at the core of everything. He's the regulating force that governs the stellar patterns and those cosmic cycles. Whereas his wife, Eurybia, another Oceanid, embodies the receptive principle of cosmic power, the expansive medium through which celestial influence manifests. Now they have their offspring, Astraeus, Pallas, and Perses, who represent the celestial cycles, martial order, and transformative destruction. Now, Nonus has in his Dionysiaca this quote, "When I, Helios the sun, reach Creus, here the constellation Aries the ram, the center of the universe, the navel star of Olympus, I, in my exaltation, let the spring increase." So that's a note about when the spring happens, but there is a cosmic cycle, a cosmic order that is ruled over by this celestial axis of Creus and Eurybia. Now, Eurybia was the goddess of power over and mastery of the sea. She presided over the external forces which influence the rise of constellations, because constellations come up over the horizon, and the seasonal weather and the power of the winds. So Astraeus, again, we're going to tertiary order. Oops. I hit the wrong button. Just a second. There we are. Astraeus is atmospheric regulation. So from Astraeus come the anemoi, the four winds, which is the celestial-terrestrial correspondence that establishes coherence between higher and lower domains. Now, the anemoi, those are the directional winds. Boreas, Zephyros, Notos, and Euros. These are the cardinal orientations of cosmic space. We are demarcating space in a cosmic sense with this celestial axis. Then we have Pallas, who's martial regulation, the subordination of force to intelligent purpose. Now, the celestial axis is coming here. The intelligible axis is coming here. At the center where they meet, that's where this martial regulation is. This subordination of force to intelligent purpose is transforming mere violence into principled opposition. This martial aspect represents not merely aggression, but the necessary tension to maintain cosmic equilibrium through dynamic opposition. So we don't want to fall out of that thematic cosmic order. If we do, then we have to deal with Perses, the transformative regulation. So Pallas is gentler, Perses is destructive, ensuring that destruction will basically result in regeneration of what has been violated. So again, you see this with Hecate as well. She's a threshold guardian. She's the daughter of Perses and Asteria, and so she contains some of his destructive, transformative power to dissolute things that are outside of the order and renew them back within the cosmic pattern of Astraeus. Now, these Creonides establish a tripartite differentiation of regulatory functions necessary for the maintenance of the cosmos. The Astra Planeta are also a part of this, the wandering stars that embody specific regulatory functions within celestial governance. We're talking about the zodiac, all of the different pieces. It starts with the Ram, the Lord, in the spring, and then everything else kind of flows with it as we move through this cosmic cycle. So there's an astrology component to all of this. So here's what we look like on the map. The Creonides, the regulators of cosmic order, the demarcation of this celestial intelligence, the extensive potentiality within Eurybia, atmospheric regulation within the starry one, who is also linked to Eos, the dawn, as you can see here, and produces the celestial stars, and the anemoi, the winds, Okay, so there's an astral mediation. There's a principled opposition with Pallas, the brandisher, and then we have the kind of the third leg here, which is like if you mess up and move outside of that order, you're going to have to deal with Hecate and Perses and the orders you don't want to deal with. Whew, we're trucking. We're moving. Okay, so we're getting closer and closer. So the next axis is this circumscribing axis with Oceanus and Tethys. Now, Oceanus embodies the active principle of circumscription, or the encircling current that establishes cosmic boundaries, this circumambient flow. Now, Oceanus is that river that surrounds the world. Now, obviously there's not an actual river, but Oceanus, they kind of pictured the ocean as this river that encircled the globe. And Tethys is the disposer of that flow. So he is the generation of it, and she is, again, the receptivity of it. She is the principle of nourishment, the generative medium that sustains all life within these boundaries. And from them, the 3,000 daughters, the Oceanids and the sons, the Potamai, the rivers, are hyper-differentiated forms of these nurturing functions. Hesiod says that Tethys bore to Oceanus the swirling Potamoi, the rivers, the rustic river gods, and a race apart of daughters, the Oceanids. Now these are the eldest of the daughters who were born to Tethys and Oceanus, but there are many others besides that, for there are 3,000 light-stepping daughters of Oceanus scattered far and wide. There's like the lakes, there's the streams and springs, there's all kinds of water elements. Now, Nonus says, loud booming Oceanus, girded with the circle of the sky, who leads his water-earth encompassing round the turning point which he bathes, was joined in primeval wedlock with Tethys. And in some, this is really interesting, in many of the older versions, it is said that Oceanus and Tethys are the generation of the gods in total. So some writers put Oceanus and Tethys at the beginning of all of this. Forget Uranus and Gaia, like some writers say that they came from Oceanus and Tethys. So there is a nurturative necessity of this watery fluidity that happens within this circumscription. It's all within water. And I think that goes back to the fact that Orpheus, the oldest theologian in all of the Greek tradition, says that everything begins with earth and water. And so there's this sense of Ophion and Euronime, who begin at the beginning of all things, which I didn't include in this because it just didn't make sense, because also there's just not much about them. But they're kind of like a proto version of Oceanus and Tethys. So if we have the active principle of containing, and then the the receptive principle and distributing of Tethys through these 3,000 daughters, the sons, the river gods, then the lakes, then the springs. So there is a hyper-differentiated nourishing through the rivers that just kind of go everywhere, right? And then you have an accumulative nurturing at lakes, which is the sustenance gathered into concentrated reservoirs as focal points. And then you have the springs, which are emergent nurturing that kind of come up out of the earth, right? So there's all this watery stuff, which is really fascinating. And so we see here, but there are some other pieces, some specific Oceanids. Now, we've seen some of them before. You see them as Eurybia, you see them as Clymene, as some of them, but there are others that are just as important, that out of the 3,000, we could probably find a ton more within Greek mythology to understand this. But not of the least importance is Metis here, who is wisdom. Now, Metis is incredibly important because she is the first wife of Zeus, who he swallows. He eats her. He eats her because he needs her wisdom and her nurturing intelligence in order to essentially bring forth the cosmos. And what happens is the classic tale of when Zeus eats her, she starts hammering away in his skull. Hammering and hammering until essentially Pallas Athena bursts forth from his forehead as wisdom incarnate, leaving behind a little bit of that cunning wisdom that Zeus needed in order to essentially take over the cosmos. But beyond Metis, we have Tyche, fortune, which is nurturing the opportunity for things to happen. Doris, who is bounty, nurturing abundance. Styx, or oath, which is nurturing integrity, and Calypso, which is nurturing more concealment. Okay, so there's a lot that goes on with these, and in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of wash over them because there's so many. I'll probably do more on the Oceanids in the future. But if you're interested, do look it up. They're really interesting. It's this circumscribing axis is really what kind of feeds everything. And you can see here, they just kind of like flow out like rivers. And there's more to this image, which is, again, posted on my website. But underneath here is all the lakes, the streams, the river gods, and all of that. But it is this explosion of differentiation through water. And finally, we get to the final axis. The final axis of this hexagrammatic matrix, whereas time, the cosmic time, through Kronos and Rhea. Kronos, the cutter, or he who strikes the mind. He who strikes the mind, Oranos, embodies the active principle of temporal limitation, the force that establishes sequential progression through delimitation. And Rhea, flow, who embodies that receptive principle of continuous becoming. She just keeps becoming. She is the mother who just keeps generating. And she's the medium through which limited moments connect to form and the experience of duration. Hesiod says, "But Rhea was subject in love to the Titan Kronos, and bare splendid children, Hestia, Demeter, gold-shot Hera, strong Hades, pitiless in heart, who dwells under the earth, Poseidon, the loud-crashing earth shaker, and wise Zeus, father of gods and men." Plato says in his Cratylus, "Well, don't you think he who gave the ancestors of the other gods the names Rhea and Kronos, which derived by Plato from the Greek words flow and time, had the same thought as Heraclitus? Do you think he gave both of them the names of streams merely by chance? Streams of time, streams of moving through this temporal existence that would then be created after this Cronian rule." So we have the temporal axis, which is basically those that govern all of time underneath, which is going to be essentially, yes, the Olympians underneath Zeus. Now you have Hestia as centered permanence. She's the heart of everything with them. Demeter, who is the Earth Mother, cyclical renewal. Hera, which is relational continuity within our marriages. Excuse me. Whew. Poseidon is the fluid transition or transformation. Hades is that unseen concealment, the culminative fulfillment. When we die, we go into this unseen realm. And then, of course, the transcendent providence of the father Zeus, which, if you really look at them, all three of them are kind of the same deity, just exploded into different. They're basically all just like a new layer of Kronos. And you see that with almost all of these secondary orders of Titans. Now, we don't usually call the Olympians Titans, but they are. All the rest of the secondary orders of Titans are born from Titans. You don't just then call them because they're secondarily born. All of those are Olympians. The Olympians, just in taking over the mantle of cosmic governance under the order of time, become their own order, essentially. And Zeus being the top of that order, he marries half of the Titans anyways. So calling them different is interesting. I prefer to call them secondary and primary orders of the Titanic cosmos. But this is where it all kind of cuts out. Like, the finality of this hexagram is this temporal axis where you see the first versions of the Olympians. Now, as we've been going through this, I've been telling you there is a geometric progression that's happening here as we move through this vertical emanation and then that hexagrammatic matrix. So you have a boundless, unutterable void and beginning that is beyond dimension of any kind. The only thing that we ever really hear about it is through Orpheus. He says it's water and earth. Then we have the point of light, the first dimension with Phanes. This is a position without extension. As that extends to Nyx, we create a line between 2 points. The secondary dimension, extension and polarity. From there, we get a third dimension, which is surface and enclosure within the triangle of Nyx, Gaia, and Uranus. And then we move from there to a tetrahedron, not necessarily a square, right? But you have Nyx, Gaia, Uranus, and the Cyclopes and Hecatonchires, which create the fourth dimension, which is volume, or room for materiality to come into being. Then you have the pentagram, which comes about with that fifth dimension, the birthing of the first orders of the Titans. And then finally, the sixth piece, the hexagram, which is going to be all six Titanic matrices, perfect balance and integration between those, and then all of their secondary orders, including the Olympians, which will create the celestial realm, which is, of course, governed by the 7 classical planets, which would be the next order of the geometry, which is the heptagram. And on we go into greater and greater levels of geometry. But that's what they're talking about in these stories. This is not just random generation of familial relations and fights. We are talking about a metaphysical understanding of the universe that was based in geometry and clear understanding of astrology and the movements of the celestial spheres. This is hyper complex way to look at the world. And we like to think of ourselves as brilliant, but I think most people would look at this and go, my head's spinning. Whereas for the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, this is just basic knowledge for them. Now, what are we really looking at with this? I'm at about an hour and 22 minutes, and I got to hustle up to finish here, but to give you guys some time for some questions. But what we're looking at is the creation of the cosmic mind. This is the mind of the demiurge that we've been displaying. All these axes, the matrix, it is the cosmic mind. It's the mind of the demiurge. Now, within this cosmological framework, Zeus assumes a position of profound significance as the demiurgic intellect who looks back towards the higher principles to contemplate the intelligible archetypes before manifesting them in a cosmic order. Now, Proclus articulates this in his commentary on Plato's Timaeus. He says, the demiurge contains the intelligible causes of all things, all those axes we were talking about, and contemplating them within himself, he brings forth the sensible cosmos as an image of the intelligible. For he does not look outside of himself to some external paradigm, but contains within himself the intelligible causes, and by means of thinking them, produces all things. That moment in the Orphic tradition where he swallows Phanes, swallows the entire universe, and becomes all things, it's within him that this mind is born. Before that, that doesn't exist. This demiurgic function represents not just an arbitrary imposition of form on matter, but a conscious alignment of manifest reality with intelligible paradigms. Zeus, as the Olympian sovereign, does not negate the Titanic order, but rather integrates and transforms it, establishing a more complex manifestation while preserving the essential patterns that were born in that primordial architecture. He is the mind. He's the upper limit of the mind, and then it's basically mirrored in us. It's mirrored within our minds and our cognitive functions. Hesiod says, but when the blessed gods had finished their toil and settled by force their struggle for honors with the Titans, they pressed far-seeing Zeus, the Olympian, to reign and rule over them by Gaia's prompting, so he divided their privileges amongst them. So he reordered the cosmos. He did it all within his head. When Zeus was grown, he engaged Oceanus' daughter Metis as a colleague, and she gave Cronos a drug by which he was forced to vomit forth the stone and the children he had swallowed. That's in Pseudo-Apollodorus' Bibliotheca. Does not even now great Atlas struggle to bear upon the weight of heaven, far from his father's lands and his possessions? But almighty Zeus set free the Titans, for as time passes the breeze abates and the sails are set anew. Pindar. So, what about this epic fight between the Olympians and the Titans, between Zeus and Cronos? What does that mean for us? Well, the Titanomachy represents not just a divine war, but a necessary metaphysical transformation that must occur. It's a transition from an analytical differentiation to a synthetic integration from specialized cosmic functions to coordinated governance. It's an idea being made manifest. The Titanomachy is about taking all these ideas that were coalescing in this Titanic mind, and then through Zeus, through his looking back towards that Titanic world, that the generative possibility occurs. The Tartarian imprisonment represents sublation rather than destruction. Zeus's eventual release of the Titans, referenced by Pindar and Aeschylus, confirms their essential place in the cosmic order. They're not banished. They're in your head. They're in your brain. Right? So what we're looking at is this vertical emanation that begins it. Then it's a hexagrammatic structure after that primal polarity. And that central position of Themis is really interesting and important. There is a divine order within the mind that must be appreciated. It's all about balance. If you go too much into this celestial axis, you're gonna run afoul of something in this circumscribing axis. If you go too far into this temporal, you're out of your mind in this intelligible axis. And same thing. Too high, too low within the liminal and the illuminative spaces. It's all about balance within that cosmic order. Now, these 6 Titanic lineages is where it gets really interesting. There's the hexagram, but then there's all the pieces that float underneath them, all the children. And we'll go into those in separate live streams because I think there's a lot to navigate there for us. But we have the temporal experience of the Chronides, which is the Kronos and Rhea's children, the wisdom acquisition of the intelligible axis of Coeus and Phoebe, the sustenance of the Oceanids of Oceanus and Tethys. There's boundary navigations with the Iapetonides, and the illuminative disclosures of the Hyperionides, and the regulatory discernment of the Creonides. Each lineage offering particular pathways through which our consciousness can realize its multidimensional potential. What I'm getting at with all this is if we have a map, then we can navigate these things, theurgically speaking. We can call upon these entities, these forces, these principles to navigate our life better. That's the whole point of this. It's a map of consciousness. That's what it is. The unutterable void at the beginning is just pure awareness, right? It's that emptiness that Buddhists talk about. And then Phanes is that primordial I am. Boom, I exist. Nyx is that subject-object differentiation where we start to see that kind of like there's me, there's you. And then from that, in that triangle, we start to see the 3 pieces of the human mind. The reptilian brain, this basal ganglia, corresponds to Gaia, this foundational terrestrial principle. Then you have the limbic system, the paleo-mammalian brain, which is this oronic, expansive celestial principle. And then you have the neo-mammalian brain, this neocortex, which corresponds to Nyx, the mediating principle between those two in that triune structure. And then from that, the birth of the Titans, those 5-6 axes that come about, those are the 5 major neural networks in the brain. You can go ahead and take a look at that. It's really interesting. It's all geometry. It's always been geometry. But what's really interesting is there is a axial interplay. It's not just these polarities, right? From the celestial to the circumscribing Oceanus axis, from left corner to bottom right, is your spatial element. Your intelligible to temporal, that is your time. So we've got space and time. And then from that spatial domain, we have revelatory and providential domains open up as we move from illuminative to liminal space. Now, again, this map will be on my website if you want to explore it more. I'm going to be writing more about each one of these on my Substack, so please do follow sub on there if you want to learn more about this. But at the center of it all is this divine order that has to be achieved. Even between these two, right? You've got celestial and temporal. That's your providential domain, right? That's where you're working. They all play off of each other. It's shifted a little bit to the right and you're in oracular territory. Shift it a little bit to the left and you are in celestial astrology territory. Shifted a little bit to the upper part of the Hyperionides and you're hyper illuminating things. Shifted a little bit to the low, you're in chthonic underworld territory. This is how we navigate things within the mind. We're finally here, guys. Plotinus says, "For the soul that has gone through this journey, there is a remembrance of all the divine things it has seen, and seeing them again, it is enabled to see things here, below, in the light of them." What he's talking about is that journey we've just been on with these Titanic members, all of these different metaphysical principles and axes that make up the structure of the cosmos for the ancient Greeks. This is what the soul undergoes as it comes through. It's all of these things. That's what the mixing bowl, the anvil, the creation, the pestle, all of the stuff that we talked about in this live stream is what the soul undergoes as it comes into the generation of the physical body. We have knowledge of all of these things as well, deep, deep within us, and that's what the practices of theurgy, of the magical elements of late antiquity, are trying to bring out in our own consciousness, is an awareness of or a remembrance of these things. That's all I got for today, guys. I got a few minutes for questions, and then I gotta because I gotta go run some errands. I realize I did throw a lot at you, so if you have any questions too, feel free to message me on the post, on the Mysteries community page, or on Substack, and we can talk more about this. But as I said, I wanted to go through a lot of this today, and then we'll break up the individual axes and the secondary orders in later live streams. But before going on to the Olympian stuff, I had to spend some time on this Titanic order because nobody's talking about it. Like, in antiquity, there's barely anything left, and in modern discourse, nobody's talking about the Titans. They're like, doesn't matter, Zeus beat them. Well, I think we're missing a lot of very intellectually rich material that can help us understand our position as people in the world, and be also very practical for our spiritual development. So if you have any questions, I got about 2 more minutes. How is the sound today? Can everybody hear me all right? I am playing with a new computer, so it is it's always going to be some sort of technical snafu with a new computer from time to time, so just wanted to check to see if the sound and visual quality was good today. Also, later today, just in a couple hours, there is a premiere of a conversation podcast interview I had with Ike Baker of the Arcanum podcast, and he's talking about his new book, Etheric Magic, in that. It's a great interview. It's coming out here at 5 p.m. Mountain. That is, what is that, 7 p.m. Eastern and 3 p.m. Pacific, I believe. All right, if you guys don't have any questions for me, I do have to get. So I will make myself more available on our next live stream. But if you do have questions, you can get at me on Substack. You'll find that on the profile. Please like and subscribe if you're watching this after the fact. Leave a comment, question